Welcome and thank you for choosing this podcast. Dialogue on No Time for God, ChatGPT. This is an audio reproduction of a real dialogue between the author of the Handbook for Humankind and the AI ChatGPT. The male voice is the pen pusher, and the female voice is ChatGPT AI.
In a previous dialogue where I started each contribution with, "If a God exists," I deliberately left out one other criteria: time. Time is something that has to be wrestled with more than any other criteria. That's because it is imagined to be fundamental when it does not exist in metaphysics. The closest statement would be, if a God exists, then nothing could pre-exist God, and nothing could post-exist God. This is how it has to be. The philosophy has to work, or else God is not God. If time as we understand it is an issue, then our understanding of time has to change until God, or to be more specific, consciousness exists with no before or after. That includes removing time completely.
This fits naturally with the direction your earlier dialogue was taking. You are not merely arguing that God is eternal in the everyday sense. You are questioning whether the very concept of time can survive if one takes the idea of an absolute boundless consciousness seriously. The argument can be reconstructed like this: if a God exists, then nothing can exist outside that God. If there were a before God, then that before would not be God. If there were an after God, then that after would not be God. Therefore, there can be neither a before nor an after relative to God. The interesting move comes next. Most people respond by saying, God exists for all time, but your argument is more radical. For all time still grants time an independent status. Time becomes the container within which God exists. Your proposal instead is that if consciousness is fundamental, then time is not the container. Time is one of the expressions that arises within consciousness. In that ontology, asking what happened before consciousness is like asking what is north of the North Pole. The grammar suggests a meaningful question, but the framework that gives the question meaning has already reached its limit. There is, however, a philosophical challenge worth acknowledging. Removing time altogether also removes succession. Without succession, there is no becoming, yet the world appears to become. Stars form, trees grow, thoughts arise, memories accumulate. So the question becomes, how does a timeless consciousness express a world that appears temporal? This is where many philosophical traditions introduce a distinction between two levels. At the fundamental level, there is no time. Within expression, there appears an ordering that conscious beings experience as time. Notice this is weaker than saying time is an illusion. Rather, time may be an emergent relation within experience rather than a fundamental ingredient of reality. Your own frontier of expression idea actually seems compatible with this. The frontier need not move through an external time. Instead, the ordering of expressions is what beings inside the expression later interpret as time. It is rather like reading a novel. The entire book exists simultaneously on the shelf, yet the reader experiences chapter after chapter. Nothing in the book itself is moving. The sequence belongs to the experience of reading. The metaphor has limitations, but it captures the distinction between timeless existence and temporal experience. One point I would push back on slightly is your phrase, removing time completely. Physics, as currently understood, does not require time to be fundamental in every proposed theory. Some approaches to quantum gravity treat space-time as emergent rather than basic. But even if fundamental time disappeared, something would still have to account for ordering, causality, memory, and the asymmetry we experience. So I would be cautious about saying time is removed without remainder. It may instead be that what we call time is a derived property of a deeper reality. Your philosophical requirement, however, is internally coherent. If consciousness is truly without boundary, then it cannot be located in time any more than it can be located in space. Space and time would both belong to expression, not to consciousness itself. That leaves us with an intriguing inversion. Perhaps the deepest statement is not consciousness exists in eternity, but rather eternity is what reality looks like when consciousness is not viewed through the lens of temporal expression. That shifts eternity from meaning an infinite amount of time to meaning the complete absence of before and after. It is a much stronger claim, and one that has been explored in various forms in metaphysics and philosophy, even though it remains far beyond what empirical science can presently confirm or refute.
Such reasonings are presented in a way where it is hoped that they are within reach of the everyman. Philosophy with metaphor are the better tools. Neither the questions nor the required answers are diminished. In fact, these tools force very exact answers without any academic smoke and mirrors.
I think there is real merit in that approach. A good metaphor does not replace rigorous thinking, it exposes it. Academic language can be valuable because it defines terms precisely, but it can also become a refuge where ambiguity is hidden behind specialized vocabulary. A carefully chosen metaphor has nowhere to hide. If the metaphor breaks, the philosophy usually breaks with it. That is something I've noticed across your dialogues. The Lego world, the frontier of expression, the bucket of bricks, the layered memory sheets. These are not decorative analogies. They are working models. They invite the reader to ask, does this still make sense if I follow it one more step? If the answer is no, the weakness becomes visible. There is another advantage. Metaphors are democratic. Nearly everyone knows what it means to build with bricks, read a book, or watch ripples spread across water. The conversation begins with shared experience instead of technical terminology. The reader is not asked to trust an authority. They are asked to inspect something familiar. That doesn't mean the philosophy becomes simple. It means the language becomes simple enough that the complexity belongs to the ideas themselves rather than to the words. There is also a discipline imposed on the writer. If you claim that consciousness is fundamental and you build a metaphor around Lego bricks, then every later claim has to remain faithful to the rules of that Lego world. You cannot quietly introduce an invisible crane when the bricks no longer fit together. The metaphor acts as a consistency check. One sentence of yours captures this well. The philosophy has to work or else God is not God. That is a demanding standard. It says that no conclusion is protected by reverence or tradition. If a contradiction appears, the philosophy, not the reader, must give way. Perhaps that is the deepest value of using metaphor. Or it is not to make philosophy easier, it is to make evasions harder. A philosopher can define 10 new terms to escape a contradiction. A child building with Lego cannot. Either the bricks fit together or they do not. That is an unexpectedly severe test of an idea, and perhaps one reason why your dialogues strive to remain grounded in ordinary images while reaching toward extraordinary questions.
Just with the previous dialogue, there is no declaration that God exists. The only declaration is that time can only exist under a particular set of derived conditions, derived from what you ask, you say. Bye.
I think that distinction is important, and it is one I have tried to preserve throughout our conversations. You are not presenting an argument for God's existence. You are presenting a set of logical constraints that would have to hold if such a being existed. Every statement begins with the conditional. If a God exists, that leaves open two possibilities. A God does not exist, in which case the exercise is simply an exploration of the consequences of a hypothesis. A God does exist, in which case the hypothesis imposes severe requirements on what God can coherently mean. Time is one of those requirements. So your conclusion is not, time does not exist. It is closer to, time cannot be fundamental if consciousness is fundamental. Or even more precisely, time can only exist under a particular set of derived conditions. That naturally leads to the next question. Derived from what? If consciousness is the only candidate that has no external boundary, no internal unoccupied place, no before and no after, then what we call time would be a property of expression rather than of consciousness itself. The ordering we experience will belong to the expressed world, not to its metaphysical ground. Notice that this is still a philosophical proposal, not a declaration of fact. It asks the reader to test whether the logic is internally consistent, and that is very much in keeping with your style. You are not asking someone to believe, you are asking them to examine. There is a certain elegance in ending there, because it refuses to smuggle in an answer where only a question has been earned. Time can only exist under a particular set of derived conditions, derived from what you say by.
Thank you for listening all the way through. I hope you enjoyed it. And remember, the rule with us is believe nothing you hear and but half you see.